A perfectly good airplane can be in perfect working order and still be in trouble. Not because the engines fail, not because the wings came off, not because the aircraft can't fly, but because the people responsible for flying it became focused on the wrong thing. That's what happened one night on Eastern Airlines Flight 401 back in 1972. The crew was preparing to land when one landing gear indicator light didn't show what they expected. It could have meant a gear problem, it could have meant a sensor problem, it could have meant a burned out bulb, a small light, a small mystery, a small distraction. But in a cockpit, small distractions can become very big problems when everyone starts staring at the same thing. The captain focused on it, the first officer focused on it, the flight engineer focused on it. 3 trained professionals all trying to solve one problem, while the airplane continued to do what they always do. It kept flying, it kept moving, it kept responding to gravity, altitude, speed, and time. That story stayed with me because years later, as a business owner, I realized founders can make the same mistake. We can become so focused on one problem, one number, one customer, one crisis, or one warning light that we stop managing the whole business. And that's when a perfectly good company can quietly drift off course. Hi, I'm Mike Conrad, host of the Reluctant Entrepreneur podcast. Since I was a child, I've always had a fascination with aviation. I was the kid on the playground who looked up every time I heard an airplane fly overhead. Other kids were probably thinking about dodgeball, lunch, or how to avoid getting picked last for kickball. I was looking up at the sky, trying to identify the aircraft. Even from the ground, I could usually tell what type of airplane it was and which airline was flying it. I'm not saying that made me popular at recess, but it did make me unusually prepared for a future involving both airplanes and business stress. 2 years before I started my company, in 1990, I earned my private pilot's license. I went through ground school, flight training, check rides, emergency procedures, navigation exercises, radio communication, weather briefings, and all the other things required to convince the FAA that handing me the keys to an airplane wasn't a terrible idea. I loved flying. I loved the discipline of it. I loved the freedom of it. I loved the feeling of leaving the ground and seeing the world from a completely different perspective. But what I didn't realize at the time was that many of the lessons I learned in the cockpit would soon eventually apply directly to business. One of the first things drilled into every pilot is this simple priority: aviate, navigate, communicate. In other words, fly the plane first, then figure out where you're going, then talk to the people you need to talk to. That order matters. You don't start with communication. You don't get so busy talking on the radio that you forget to fly the plane. You don't get so focused on navigation that you let the aircraft drift into an unsafe condition. You fly the airplane first because everything else depends on that. I've always had somewhat of a morbid guilty pleasure of studying NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, accident reports. I know that sounds strange. Some people read mysteries, some people read biographies. Apparently, I read accident reports written in painfully precise government language about why airplanes ended up where airplanes were not supposed to be. And one of the most haunting lessons from those reports is how often accidents come down to pilot error. Not because the pilots were careless, not because they were unintelligent. Often they were experienced, professional, capable people. But somewhere along the way, attention narrowed. Focus collapsed into one problem. The crew became so absorbed in one issue that they stopped managing the whole aircraft. One well-known example is Eastern Airlines Flight 401, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar that crashed into the Florida Everglades on December 29, 1972. The aircraft was preparing to land when the crew became concerned about a landing gear indicator light. In a commercial aircraft, when the landing gear is lowered and locked, the crew expects to see 3 green lights, one for each landing gear position. On that flight, one of the lights didn't indicate properly, raising the possibility that part of the landing gear wasn't locked. That's a serious issue, and it deserved attention. The problem was, it got too much attention. There were 3 pilots on board, the captain, the first officer, and the flight engineer. all three became focused on troubleshooting the landing gear indication. Was the gear actually down? Was it a sensor problem? Was it a burned out light? Was it a mechanical issue? Meanwhile, unbeknownst to the pilots, the aircraft was slowly descending over the Everglades at night. The landscape below offered very little visual reference. The instruments were showing exactly what was happening, but the crew's attention was elsewhere. By the time the warning came,
Terrain, pull up,
it was too late. They had focused on the landing gear problem and failed to aviate. That lesson stayed with me because business has its own version of that crash. In business, it's very easy to get fixated on one problem, not because the problem doesn't matter, but because it feels urgent. It demands attention. It screams louder than anything else. Early in my business, payroll was one of those problems. Every Thursday, we had to cover payroll. That meant by Monday or Tuesday, I was chasing cash. And when you're chasing cash, your field of vision gets very narrow. I'd make deals I shouldn't have made. I'd accept low margin orders. Sometimes I'd take no margin orders. I'd do whatever I had to do to bring cash in the door so we could make payroll. Problem solved. At least that problem. But then another problem appeared. Those low profit or no profit orders created margin problems. Margin problems created cash problems. Cash problems created more pressure. More pressure led to more bad decisions. It became a loop. I was troubleshooting the landing gear while the business was slowly descending. The same thing can happen with profit. If you focus only on improving profit, you may start cutting costs too aggressively. That can affect quality, customer service, delivery, employee morale, or long-term capability. You might improve the numbers on one instrument while ignoring the fact that three others are flashing red. If you focus only on quality, you may create processes so slow and expensive that the company can't compete. If you focus only on customer service, you may say yes so often that the team burns out. If you focus only on growth, you may outgrow your cash. If you focus only on cost cutting, you may cut away the very things that make the company valuable. That's why Aviate, Navigate, Communicate applies so well to business. Aviate means keep the business flying. You can't let one urgent issue pull so much attention that the rest of the company starts descending unnoticed. Navigate means know where you're going. A business can survive a lot of turbulence if there's still a clear heading. What kind of company are you building? What customers are you trying to serve? What work should you accept? What work should you walk away from? What does success look like beyond simply surviving the week? Communicate means keep people informed. Employees need to know the priorities. Customers need honest expectations. Vendors need clarity. Lenders and advisors need reality, not optimism dressed up as a spreadsheet. Silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates its own kind of turbulence. But the order still matters. Fly the business, then make sure you're pointed in the right direction. Then communicate clearly with the people who are part of the journey. Another flying lesson that applies directly to business is the importance of slow, deliberate corrections. When you're flying and you drift off course, the temptation is to make a big correction. You turn aggressively back toward the line. But if you overcorrect, you don't smoothly return to course. You blow right through it. Then you correct the other way. Then you blow through it again. Now the airplane is weaving back and forth across the desired course like a pilot trying to draw a snake in the sky. The same thing happens with altitude. If you're too high and push the nose down too aggressively, you may descend through the assigned altitude. If you pull back up too aggressively and climb above it again. Instead of solving the problem, you create a new one, or a bunch of new ones. Good flying usually requires smooth, deliberate corrections. Business does too. When sales are down, the temptation is to panic and discount everything. That may create a short-term bump in orders, but it can damage margin, train customers to wait for discounts, and create a new cash problem later. When cash is tight, the temptation is to slash expenses quickly. Some cuts may be necessary, but panic cutting can damage capacity, morale, quality, and customer support. When delivery is late, the temptation is to push harder, rush production, skip steps, or overload people. That may ship one order faster, but it can create quality problems, rework, warranty issues, and an exhausted team. When growth appears, the temptation is to hire too quickly, buy too much equipment, expand too fast, or assume the good times will continue forever. That kind of overcorrection can turn a sales success into a cash crisis. I made plenty of those kinds of corrections. I didn't always gently adjust the heading. Sometimes I yanked the controls, overcorrected, and had to fix the new problem I created while fixing the first problem. That's one of the difficult lessons of leadership. Not every problem requires a dramatic response. Sometimes the right move is smaller, calmer, and more deliberate than fear wants it to be. Fear says, do something now. Wisdom says, do the right thing next. Those aren't always the same. The cockpit teaches discipline because the airplane gives feedback immediately. If you overcorrect, you see it. If you stop scanning the instruments, the aircraft tells on you. If you get distracted, the airplane keeps flying, but not necessarily where you intended. A business is less obvious. It may take several weeks, months, or even years for the consequences of an overreaction to show up. But the principle is the same. You have to keep scanning the instruments. Cash is an instrument. Margin is an instrument. Quality is an instrument. Customer satisfaction is an instrument. Employee morale is an instrument. Backlog is an instrument. Inventory is an instrument. Debt is an instrument. Delivery performance is an instrument. No single instrument tells the whole story. A pilot who only watches the airspeed indicator can still crash. A business owner who only watches sales can still fail. You need the full panel. And just like in flying, the goal isn't to avoid every deviation. That's impossible. Winds shift, weather changes, equipment acts up, customers change their minds, markets soften, vendors miss deadlines, employees leave, mistakes happen. The goal is to notice the deviation early, understand what's happening, and make the appropriate correction without turning one problem into 5. That's the business lesson I took from aviation. Don't become so focused on the landing gear light that you stop flying the airplane. Don't chase payroll so aggressively that you destroy margin. Don't chase profit so aggressively that you damage quality. Don't chase growth so aggressively that you run out of cash. Don't chase one number so intensely that you lose sight of the business as a whole. Aviate, navigate, communicate. Fly the business. Know where you're going. Keep people informed. And when the business drifts off course, don't panic and yank the controls. Make a slow, deliberate correction. Watch the instruments, let the business settle, then, if necessary, adjust again. Because in flying and in business, overreaction can be just as dangerous as inaction. Sometimes the job is not to make a heroic move. Sometimes the job is simply to keep the airplane flying. I hope you enjoyed this content. There's more of this on the Reluctant Entrepreneur podcast channels on YouTube and on all popular podcast sites. Thanks for being here. I'll see you again soon.